The Four Noble Truths by Ajahn Sumedho. Written in 1992 and copyright free. A handful of leaves. The Blessed One was once living at Kosambi in a wood of Simsapa trees. He picked up a few leaves in his hand, and he asked the bhikkhus, "How do you conceive this, bhikkhus? Which is more, the few leaves that I have picked up in my hand, or those on the trees in the wood?" "The leaves that the Blessed One has picked up in his hand are few, Lord. Those in the wood are far more." "So too, bhikkhus, the things that I have known by direct knowledge are more. The things that I have told you are only a few. Why have I not told them? Because they bring no benefit, no advancement in the holy life, and because they do not lead to dispassion, to fading, to ceasing, to stilling, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. That is why I have not told them. And what have I told you? This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. That is what I have told you. Why have I told it? Because it brings benefit and advancement in the holy life, and because it leads to dispassion, to fading, to ceasing, to stilling, to direct knowledge, to enlightenment, to nibbana. So bhikkhus, let your task be this. This is suffering. This is the origin of suffering. This is the cessation of suffering. This is the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Samyutta Nikaya, LVI 31. Preface. This small booklet was compiled and edited from talks given by Venerable Ajahn Sumedho on the central teaching of the Buddha, that the unhappiness of humanity can be overcome through spiritual means. The teaching is conveyed through the Buddha's Four Noble Truths, first expounded in 528 BC in the deer park at Sarnath near Varanasi, and kept alive in the Buddhist world ever since. Venerable Ajahn Sumedho is a bhikkhu, mendicant monk, of the Theravada tradition of Buddhism. He was ordained in Thailand in 1966 and trained there for 10 years. He is currently the abbot of Amaravati Buddhist Center, as well as teacher and spiritual guide to many bhikkhus, Buddhist nuns, and lay people. This booklet has been made available through the voluntary efforts of many people for the welfare of others. Note on the text. The first exposition of the Four Noble Truths was a discourse, sutta, called Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Literally, the discourse that. Note on the text. The first exposition of the Four Noble Truths was a discourse, sutta, called Dhammacakkappavattana Sutta. Literally, the discourse that sets the vehicle of the teaching in motion. Extracts from this are quoted at the beginning of each chapter describing the Four Truths. The reference quoted is the section in the books of the scriptures where this discourse can be found. However, the theme of the Four Noble Truths recurs many times, for example, in the quotation that appears at the beginning of the introduction. Introduction. That both I and you have had to travel and trudge through this long round is owing to our not discovering, not penetrating the four truths. What for? They are the noble truth of suffering, the noble truth of the origin of suffering, the noble truth of the cessation of suffering, and the noble truth of the way leading to the cessation of suffering. Digha Nikaya Sutta 16. The Dhammacakka Pavatana Sutta, the Buddha's teaching on the Four Noble Truths, has been the main reference that I have used for my practice over the years. It is a teaching we used in our monastery in Thailand. The Theravada school of Buddhism regards this sutta as the quintessence of the teaching of the Buddha. This one sutta contains all that is necessary for understanding Dhamma and for enlightenment. Though the Dhammacakka Pavatana Sutta is considered to be the first sermon the Buddha gave after his enlightenment, I sometimes like to think that he gave his first sermon when he met an ascetic on the way to Varanasi. After his enlightenment in Bodh Gaya, the Buddha thought, "This is such a subtle teaching. I cannot possibly convey in words what I have discovered, so I will not teach. I will just sit under the Bodhi tree for the rest of my life." For me, this is a very tempting idea, just to go off and live alone and not have to deal with the problems of society. However, while the Buddha was thinking this way, Brahma Sahampati, the creator deity in Hinduism, came to the Buddha and convinced him that he should go and teach. Brahma Sahampati persuaded the Buddha that there were beings who would understand, beings who had only a little dust in their eyes. So the Buddha's teaching was aimed towards those with only a little dust in their eyes. I'm sure he did not think it would become a mass popular movement. After Brahma Sahampati's visit, the Buddha was on his way from Bodh Gaya to Varanasi when he met an ascetic who was impressed by his radiant appearance. The ascetic said, "What is it that you have discovered?" And the Buddha responded, "I am the perfectly enlightened one, the Arahant, the Buddha." I like to consider this his first sermon. It was a failure because the man listening thought the Buddha had been practicing too hard and was overestimating himself. If somebody said those words to us, I'm sure we would react similarly. What would you do if I said, "I am the perfectly enlightened one"? Actually, the Buddha's statement was a very accurate, precise teaching. It is the perfect teaching, but people cannot understand it. They tend to misunderstand and to think it comes from an ego because people are always interpreting everything from their egos. "I am the perfectly enlightened one" may sound like an egotistical statement, but isn't it really purely transcendent? That statement, "I am the Buddha, the perfectly enlightened one," is interesting to contemplate because it connects the use of "I am" with superlative attainments or realizations. In any case, the result of the Buddha's first teaching was that the listener could not understand it and walked away. Later, the Buddha met his 5 former companions in the deer park in Varanasi. All 5 were very secretly dedicated to strict asceticism. They had been disillusioned with the Buddha earlier because they thought he had become insincere in his practice. This was because the Buddha, before he was enlightened, had begun to realize that strict asceticism was in no way conducive towards an enlightened state, so he was no longer practicing in that way. These 5 friends thought he was taking it easy. Maybe they saw him eating rice milk which would perhaps be comparable to eating ice cream these days. If you were an ascetic and you see a monk eating ice cream, you might lose faith in him because you think that monks should be eating nettle soup. If you really loved asceticism and you saw me eating a dish of ice cream, you would have no faith in Ajahn Sumedho anymore. That is the way the human mind works. We tend to admire impressive feats of self-torture and denial. When they lose faith in him, these 5 friends or disciples left the Buddha, which gave him the chance to sit under the Bodhi tree and be enlightened. Then, when they met the Buddha again in the deer park in the Varanasi, the 5 thought at first, we know what he's like. Let's just not bother about him. But as he came near, they all felt that there was something special about him. They stood up to make a place for him to sit down, and he delivered his sermon on the Four Noble Truths. This time, instead of saying, I am the enlightened one, he said, there is suffering. There is the origin of suffering. There is the cessation of suffering. There is the path out of suffering. Presented in this way, his teaching requires no acceptance or denial. If he had said, I am the all-enlightened one, we would be forced to either agree or disagree, or just be bewildered. We wouldn't quite know how to look at that statement. However, by saying there is suffering, there is a cause, there is an end to suffering, and there is a way out of suffering, he offered something for reflection. What do you mean by this? What do you mean by suffering, its origin, cessation, and the path? So we start contemplating it, thinking about it. With the statement, I am the all-enlightened one, we might just argue about it. Is he really enlightened? I don't think so. We would just argue. We are not ready for a teaching that is so direct. Obviously, the Buddha's first sermon was to somebody who still had a lot of dust in his eyes, and it failed. So on the second occasion, he gave the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. Now, the Four Noble Truths are, there is suffering, there is a cause or origin of suffering, there is an end of suffering, and there is a path out of suffering, which is the Eightfold Path. Each of these truths has 3 aspects, so altogether there are 12 insights. In the Theravada school, an arahant, a perfected one, is one who has seen clearly the Four Noble Truths with their 3 aspects and 12 insights. Arahant means a human being who understands the truth. It is applied mainly to the teaching of the Four Noble Truths. For the first noble truth, there is suffering, is the first insight. What is that insight? We don't need to make it into anything grand. It is just the recognition. There is suffering. That is a basic insight. The ignorant person says, I'm suffering. I don't want to suffer. I meditate and I go on retreats to get out of suffering, but I'm still suffering and I don't want to suffer. How can I get out of suffering? What can I do to get rid of it? But that is not the first noble truth. It is not, I am suffering and I want to end it. The insight is, there is suffering. Now you are looking at the pain or the anguish you feel, not from the perspective of, it's mine, but as a reflection. There is this suffering, this dukkha. It is coming from the reflective position of Buddha seeing the Dhamma. The insight is simply the acknowledgement that there is this suffering without making it personal. That acknowledgement is an important insight. Just looking at mental anguish or physical pain and seeing it as dukkha rather than as personal misery. Just seeing it as dukkha and not reacting to it in a habitual way. The second insight of the first noble truth is suffering should be understood. The second insight or aspect of each of the noble truths has the word should in it. It should be understood. The second insight then is that dukkha is something to understand. One should understand dukkha, not just try to get rid of it. We can look at the word understanding as standing under. It is a common enough word, but in Pali, understanding means to really accept the suffering, stand under or embrace it rather than just react to it. With any form of suffering, physical or mental, we usually just react, but with understanding, we can really look at suffering, really accept it, really hold it and embrace it. So that is the second aspect. We should understand suffering. The third aspect of the first noble truth is suffering has been understood. When you have actually practiced with suffering, looking at it, accepting it, knowing it, and letting it be the way it is, then there is the third aspect. Suffering has been understood, or dukkha has been understood. So these are the three aspects of the first noble truth. There is dukkha. It is to be understood, and it has been understood. This is the pattern for the three aspects of each noble truth. There is a statement, then the prescription, and then the result of having practiced. One can also see it in terms of the Pali words pariyati, patipati, and pativeda. The pariyati is the theory or the statement. There is suffering. Patipati is the practice, actually practicing with it. And pativeda is the result of the practice. This is what we call a reflective pattern. You are actually developing your mind in a very reflective way. A Buddha mind is a reflective mind that knows things as they are. We use these four noble truths for our development. We apply them to ordinary things in our lives, to ordinary attachments and obsessions of the mind. With these truths, we can investigate our attachments in order to have the insights. Through the third noble truth, we can realize this cessation, the end of suffering, and practice the Eightfold Path until there is understanding. When the Eightfold Path has been fully developed, one is an arahant. One has made it. Even though this sounds complicated, 4 truths, 3 aspects, 12 insights, it is quite simple. It is a tool for us to use to help us understand suffering and non-suffering. Within the Buddhist world, there are not many Buddhists who use the 4 noble truths anymore, even in Thailand. People say, oh yes, the 4 noble truths, beginner stuff. Then they might use all kinds of vipassana techniques and become really obsessed with the 16 stages before they get to the noble truths. I find it quite boggling that in the Buddhist world, the really profound teaching has been dismissed as primitive Buddhism. That's for the little kids, the beginners. The advanced course is they go into complicated theories and ideas, forgetting the most profound teaching. The Four Noble Truths are a lifetime's reflection. It is not just a matter of realizing the Four Noble Truths, the three aspects and 12 stages, and becoming an arahant on one retreat and then going on to something advanced. The Four Noble Truths are not easy like that. They require an ongoing attitude of vigilance, and they provide the context for a lifetime of examination. The first Noble Truth. What is the noble truth of suffering? Birth is suffering, aging is suffering, sickness is suffering, disassociation from the loved is suffering, not to get what one wants is suffering. In short, the 5 categories affected by clinging are suffering. There is this noble truth of suffering. Such was the vision, insight, wisdom, knowing, and light that arose in me about things not heard before. This noble truth must be penetrated by fully understanding suffering. Such was the vision, insight, wisdom, knowing, and light that arose in me about things not heard before. This noble truth has been penetrated by fully understanding suffering. Such was the vision, insight, wisdom, knowing, and light that arose in me about things not heard before. Samyutta Nikaya, LVI 11. The first noble truth with its 3 aspects is there is suffering, dukkha. Dukkha should be understood. Dukkha has been understood. This is a very skillful teaching because it is expressed in a simple formula which is easy to remember, and it also applies to everything that you can possibly experience or do or think concerning the past, present, or the future. Suffering, or dukkha, is the common bond we all share. Everybody everywhere suffers. Human beings suffered in the past, in ancient India, they suffer in modern Britain, and in the future, human beings will also suffer. What do we have in common with Queen Elizabeth? We suffer. With a tramp in Charing Cross, what do we have in common? Suffering. It includes all levels from the most privileged human beings to the most desperate and underprivileged ones, and all ranges in between. Everybody everywhere suffers. It is a bond we have with each other, something we all understand. When we talk about our human suffering, it brings out our compassionate tendencies. But when we talk about our opinions about what I think and what you think about politics and religion, then we can get into wars. I remember seeing a film in London about 10 years ago. It tried to portray Russian people as human beings by showing Russian women with babies and Russian men taking their children out for picnics. At the time, this presentation of the Russian people was unusual because most of the propaganda of the West made them out to be titanic monsters or cold-hearted reptilian people, and so you never thought of them as human beings. If you want to kill people, you have to make them out to be that way. You cannot very well kill somebody if you realize that they suffer the way you do. You have to think that they are cold-hearted, immoral, worthless, and bad, and that it is better to get rid of them. You have to think that they are evil and that it is good to get rid of them. You have to think that they are evil and that it is good to get rid of evil. With this attitude, you might feel justified in bombing and machine gunning them. If you keep in mind our common bond of suffering, that makes you quite incapable of doing those things. The first noble truth is not a dismal metaphysical statement saying that everything is suffering. Notice that there is a difference between a metaphysical doctrine in which you are making a statement about the absolute and a noble truth which is a reflection. A noble truth is a truth to reflect upon. It is not an absolute. It is not the absolute. This is where Western people get very confused because they interpret this noble truth as a kind of metaphysical truth of Buddhism, but it was never meant to be that. You can see that the first noble truth is not an absolute statement because of the fourth noble truth, which is the way of non-suffering. You cannot have absolute suffering and then have a way out of it, can you? That doesn't make sense. Yet some people will pick up on the first noble truth and say that Buddha taught that everything is suffering. The Pali word dukkha means incapable of satisfying, or not able to bear or withstand anything, always changing, incapable of truly fulfilling us or making us happy. The sensual word is like that, a vibration in nature. It would, in fact, be terrible if we did find satisfaction in the sensory world, because then we wouldn't search beyond it. We'd just be bound to it. However, as we awaken to this dukkha, we begin to find the way out so that we are no longer constantly trapped in sensory consciousness. Suffering and self-view. It is important to reflect upon the phrasing of the first noble truth. It is phrased in a very clear way. There is suffering, rather than I suffer. Psychologically, that reflection is a much more skillful way to put it. We tend to interpret our suffering as, I'm really suffering, I suffer a lot, and I don't want to suffer. This is the way our thinking mind is conditioned. I am suffering always conveys the sense of I am somebody who is suffering a lot. This suffering is mine. I've had a lot of suffering in my life. Then the whole process, the association with oneself and one's memory takes off. You remember what happened when you were a baby and so on. But note, we are not saying there is someone who has suffering. It is not personal suffering anymore when we see it as there is suffering. It is not, oh, poor me, why do I have to suffer so much? What did I do to deserve this? Why do I have to get old? Why do I have sorrow, pain, grief, and despair? It is not fair. I do not want it. I only want happiness and security. This kind of thinking comes from ignorance, which complicates everything and results in personality problems. To let go of suffering, we have to admit it into consciousness. But the admission in Buddhist meditation is not from a position of I am suffering, but rather there is the presence of suffering, because we are not trying to identify with the problem, but simply acknowledge that there is one. It is unskillful to think in terms of I am an angry person, I get angry so easily, how do I get rid of it? That triggers off all the underlying assumptions of a self, and it is very hard to get any perspective on that. It becomes very confused because the sense of my problems or my thoughts takes us very easily to suppression or to making judgments about it and criticizing ourselves. We tend to grasp and identify rather than to observe, witness, and understand things as they are. When you are just admitting that there is this feeling of confusion, that there is this greed or anger, then there is an honest reflection on the way it is, and you have taken out all the underlying assumptions, or at least undermined them. So do not grasp these things as personal faults, but keep contemplating these conditions as impermanent, unsatisfactory, and non self. Keep reflecting, seeing them as they are. The tendency is to view life from the sense that these are my problems, and that one is being very honest and forthright in admitting this. Then our life tends to reaffirm that because we keep operating from that wrong assumption. But that very viewpoint is impermanent, unsatisfactory, and non self. There is suffering, is a very clear, precise acknowledgement that at this time there is some feeling of unhappiness. It can range from anguish and despair to mild irritation. Dukkha does not necessarily mean severe suffering. You do not have to be brutalized by life. You do not have to come from Auschwitz or Belsen to say there is suffering. Even Queen Elizabeth would say there is suffering. I'm sure she has moments of great anguish and despair, or at least moments of irritation. The sensory world is a sensitive experience. It means you are always being exposed to pleasure and pain and the dualism of samsara. It is like being in something that is very vulnerable and picking up everything that happens to come in contact with these bodies and their senses. That is the way it is. That is the result of birth.